Hey, welcome everybody. I am joined once again with my good friend and partner Joe Stocker at Patriot Consulting. We are here to talk about a number of different things today, but in the honor of Cybersecurity Month here in October, we thought it would be relevant to discuss a few kind of current events, our thoughts, and kind of the professional analysis that's been done on some of those things, and dive in a little deeper where it makes sense. Joe?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Stephen. I thought what we could do maybe in today is go back to a really interesting breach that occurred earlier this year with what happened to Cisco, and then if we have time, also with what's happened to Uber and some others, and what are kind of the similarities, but also what can we really learn from these, and what are maybe recommendations as practitioners that we can extrapolate here. I thought it'd be a fun conversation if maybe we go back to that to the attack that was announced in August around Cisco.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so I'll kind of set the stage a little bit. So in August, all of us were really surprised to hear that Cisco, a major player in security, right? Many of us that have been in InfoSec for years and years, we remember back in the days, Cisco firewalls, and back in those days, if you had on premise and a Cisco firewall, you really didn't hear about data breaches happening all that often. Certainly not like today. Well, the whole world has changed with data and services leaving the perimeter and being out, software as a service and infrastructure as a service. That firewall mindset was no longer really sufficient, and that's really I think contributed to what we've been seeing the last decade or so. But still, I think a lot of us sort of look up to these larger security organizations, and I think we kind of have high expectations that they're implementing the solutions that they're selling. And many of them have. But I think what I really admire about how Cisco responded was the level of transparency in the forensic report that they made public in August, because
Mhm.
you see this common trend after a data breach. Either people try to cover up and conceal, which I think recently in the Uber breach, there was an executive who I think, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was some jail time with the
Yeah.
executive from Uber who actually attempted to conceal a breach. Well, you have Cisco on the other end of the spectrum that is so transparent with what happened. And I think all of us that read this were immediately impressed with the transparency. They shared really, really key details, because the reason why that's so important is we can then all learn from it. What was the defenses that were at the time there, and what is Cisco doing to prevent something similar from occurring. So I thought today we might actually walk through what happened, learn from that, and instead of kind of shaming Cisco like, hey, you should have done better and should have blah blah blah, it's like, look, they were transparent. Let's applaud that aspect of it. But yeah, it's just such an intriguing story when you hear of a big security company getting breached. It reminds me back, the one I remember was the Bit9 breach,
Mm.
many years ago. Really caught my attention because here you have this kind of whitelisting solution. We now say allow listening, but this solution that basically prevents rogue executables from launching.
Mm.
And what does the attacker do? They say, okay, we have these targets in mind, and so what we're going to do is, because we can't execute malware because they're using Bit9, we're going to actually compromise Bit9, get their code signing certificate, sign our malware to run in that target organization. And we see the early inclinations of these supply chain attacks. When an attacker really wants to get into an organization, they will go after the trusted vendors where the executables are trusted and everything. And so a decade ago, we saw that in Bit9. We saw that with Citrix, Kaseya, SolarWinds, this kind of theme. And so the concern is when someone like Cisco, did the attacker get access to source code that we're all running, our networks on and whatnot. And so Lot to digest there, but a very exciting topic for me. I think all of us that are in this space have a lot to learn from this incident, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think to your point about Cisco, that really is kind of a feather in their cap, and looking at when I say that, I mean the disclosure, and then how the manner in which they disclose those details and the format was very much something that you would see it going into like a cyber insurance claim or an actual bona fide forensic report that would be reviewed in court. Like it was very detailed. They called out all the IOCs, all the IP addresses, the accounts, really everything from the initial vector to all the MITRE attack mappings that they provided for all the different stages of lateral movement and activity that they observed. They really did a bang up job from that perspective, and I do think it's very worth giving them credit for that. And what's interesting, and in parallel on the flip side with a breach like Uber, where, as you said, there's some criminal proceedings that are being talked about and jail time potentially. Um, it really is the job of the CISO to hold the line on all risk and not just cyber risk. You know, having a criminal proceeding levied against the company in any capacity is a risk, right? And that's something that they need to be mindful of in how they manage all of these circumstances going on, because there's always going to be pressures, right? There's always going to be pressures from the board, from key executives, from departments and folks involved. But those pressures can be handled in an appropriate way or an inappropriate way, as we see in these two key examples.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do here is maybe kind of just walk through this report and this disclosure. The first thing that jumped out to me was that a Cisco employee's credentials were compromised after the attacker gained control of their personal Google account, where credentials were saved in the victim's browser and being synchronized. Okay, so let's talk about this. How many times when we talk to clients are we expanding the conversation of privileged access to someone's personal accounts? It's an interesting element to look at here, that when we are talking to a domain admin, a global admin, someone with highly privileged credentials, are they using a Google Chrome browser with extensions where they're password vaulting? Are those credentials that they're password vaulting storing credentials that are recycled, and it's the same or similar password as that privileged user in their enterprise network? Right. So we don't know exactly if that's what occurred here. We know that it was related to their Google Chrome account, their personal account, and we know that the browser was synchronizing passwords. So I can maybe speculate that perhaps those passwords were basically recycled, perhaps, where let's say it was assigned into like a ServiceNow account, and it's the same password as maybe they use for their network. But
Mhm.
really raising awareness here, how are we vaulting passwords for our administrators? Are the administrative passwords different than what they use on their daily driver kind of activity accounts? This particular breach, when we go back and trace it back to the origins, makes us, I think, really sit up and pay attention, because a lot of people are using the web browser to save credentials. A lot of people. It's just convenient, right? The web browser, hey, would you like to save that password? So, from an enterprise perspective, it really begs the question, are we really controlling web browser extensions and the ability to save passwords in web browsers, in those kind of consulting conversations and risk and strategy and whatnot? It's a very important topic, because that's how this whole thing kind of kicked off, right?
Well, and that begs the question or conversation also about configuration management across the enterprise, right? How have you set the circumstances for your users to engage with your systems, and are you accounting for these kind of loopholes or use cases that could create these circumstances again? Do you control browsers? Do you control browser extensions? Have you
Yep.
even thought about it? A lot of people probably hadn't or weren't thinking heavily about it outside of certain specific regulated circles. But it really is something, as we've seen from this report and what happened with Cisco. that can very directly lead to that for all the reasons that you just stated, right?
Yeah.
Admins are humans too. They're going to reuse passwords. They're going to, there'll be patterns that can be found by attackers, even if they didn't reuse the password in its entirety. That can be used in library-based attacks and other things to help compromise identity in those organizations.
Yeah. So that's kind of that first thing is, as you mentioned, configuration management, controlling web browsers. I think one big takeaway here is if we do advise folks to prevent the web browser from storing passwords because of the risk that that could then get synced, because that's the whole security versus usability trade-off here. Is if I sync my passwords across web browsers and that's storing to a personal account, and that personal account is not protected by MFA, just a username and password. Now the attacker can get in there, get the creds, and then we give them a front door. So again, I think you bring up a great point: configuration management, and then really having a discussion on whether or not we want passwords to be saved to browsers, because where is that getting stored? Where is that being saved? If we take that away from the users, how are they going to securely store passphrases for multiple services? Because we don't want them to be recycling passwords. So again, before we take something away, and this is kind of that CISO conversation, is what tools and what resources do we have available as an alternative to prevent storing to personal accounts? Can we offer that for enterprise? So great conversation. We have so much more to talk about. I think we should park that one there, because there's another really fascinating, I think, conversation, and it's a theme that we're seeing across many of these breaches, which is MFA fatigue. So the next point in this disclosure, Stephen, is that the attacker used sophisticated voice phishing attacks under the guise of various trusted organizations, attempting to convince the victim to accept an MFA push notification that was initiated from the attacker. So the attacker has the passwords. They got them from the Google, password synchronization to the personal account. They're attempting to sign in. The victim gets a push notification on their Cisco Duo, MFA, and now the attacker has to convince this person to hit yes. So how do they go about this, right? They are attempting multiple, it says, phone calls, voice calls to this target, this victim, trying to convince them to hit yes on this push. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Like, what would that phone call have been like? And you may have experience on what that may have said, but it's a voice call coming in saying probably, hey, you're getting an MFA push. That's IT. We need you to accept that. Presumably along those lines, right?
Yeah, so really, whenever there's a vishing layer to any attack, it's incredibly common for the attacker to play the role of either a trusted IT admin, developer, or someone else who would be expected to have that kind of access, or to be in a position to be requesting what they're requesting. In this case, they probably called up and said, "Hey, we're doing some maintenance on your account. We need X, Y, and Z. You're gonna be getting a password notification to your text messages. I need you to provide me the code so that we can continue troubleshooting this issue," or something, right? They're It doesn't even have to be ultra sophisticated to give the appearance and the experience to that end user who's not in the know, most likely, about who it is they're talking to, um, what that looks like. But it really, in my opinion, highlights the need for security awareness training across the board. um Really, a lot of people give lip service to it. They do their once a year, or 4 times a year, whatever the cadence might be, and they just kind of put it on the shelf and forget about it. But like, at the end of the day, what we should take away from these situations where, like, MFA fatigue, which is really just another social engineering mechanism, right? MFA fatigue isn't just now kind of the newest layer, because MFA is being used as a barrier to a lot of attacks, and SMS is arguably one of the least beneficial forms of MFA, as is evidenced by this, because it's easier for an attacker to compromise. It's a code that they can obtain from a user, versus like FIDO2 based MFA that is a little bit more resilient to these type of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what ended up happening, the attacker, after they got the push acceptance, it says ultimately they were able to then gain access to the VPN. So presumably the Cisco AnyConnect, they're on the VPN under the context of this user. They start moving around. Eventually, they get into Active Directory after elevating privilege. They're able to export the Active Directory hashes of the passwords for all Cisco employees. They attempt to exfiltrate those, I believe, over SMB. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit later if we have time. So what does Cisco do? So Cisco responds. They eventually detect this and they reset the passwords of all, I think it said 80,000 plus employees. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it didn't end there. The attacker, according to this report, was able to regain access because the people that were resetting their passwords, they didn't change the password to something unique enough. It was still very similar to their prior password. So for example, let's say that my password was Cisco ASA 1234 exclamation point, right? After the password reset, what did that employee do? They changed their password to Cisco 12345 exclamation point or some derivative, because according to the forensic disclosure, the attacker was able to regain access after the password change because according to the report, the password was not changed significantly enough different than the original password, which I think really raises an important point here. If your incident response plan is dependent upon a password reset, to your point on user education and training, we have to emphasize the importance of using something unique. But the problem is when you get an organization with 80,000 plus employees, we're never going to ever get those passwords perfect. And so it really does get back to the strength of MFA and this problem of MFA fatigue. Because if we can't depend on passwords ever, really solving the issue, how can we configure MFA in a way that is resistant to MFA fatigue attack? Resistant meaning not subject to social engineering or human error. And I would propose adding a layer of device authentication, which is one of the recommendations in this disclosure report is, and this is what Cisco is planning to do. They're planning on moving away from just the Cisco Duo prompt and actually authenticating the device, which I think is really a very, very smart thing to do, because then regardless of what happens with the user and the attacker and social engineering, if the attacker's machine is not a trusted device, then regardless of what happens to the user, we have this third factor. We've got password, we have the authenticator app or Duo, and then we have this device authentication. So I think from a security strategy and standpoint, if we were to take away just one lesson here, after seeing what happened after this mass password reset, the attackers were still able to regain persistence even after this massive password change because of the vulnerability of MFA and fatigue. And you mentioned SMS and all these things. Adding that device layer is such an important part. If we're to really get ahead of some of these big attacks, device authentication is critical. Now, I can mention what I mean by that, but I'd love your thoughts first on that recommendation.
Yeah, no, I think it's spot on, and that's why I mentioned FIDO2. For those that aren't familiar with the standard, FIDO2 is basically a security standard that specifically prescribes a particular security architecture around device-based authentication. And so there are devices you could purchase that do this. There are technologies that allow you to do this with like existing domain assets as an example. But at the end of the day, as long as you're complying with a framework like FIDO2, and you are, to Joe, to your point, implementing device-based authentication as a factor in your authentication stack, you're going to be much more resistant to attacks like this, even if there is social engineering or MFA fatigue that's happening.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, I think the FIDO2 security keys are really an important element. There's two things that I see happening with organizations that are looking at FIDO2, especially a security key solution. One is the cost, right? The common pushback is, okay, I've got 80,000 employees and I have to now buy these keys, and maybe they should be looking at it for high value targets and privileged users. But the biggest pushback I get is cost, and then also the key maintenance, lost keys, and the sort of thing. The second issue with the FIDO2 is the mobility issue. So even though the key manufacturers, to no fault of themselves, they have come up with near field communication FIDO2 keys, they've come up with lightning connectors that can plug in iPhones. They've done all the right things there, but the issue that I've seen and experienced is that the actual like iOS support for, say, Azure AD is an IDP, right? A lot of people are using Office 365 in Azure, and right now we don't have FIDO2 support if you're trying to authenticate to Office 365, which most people are using for email and whatnot, when I'm talking specifically on a mobile device. So the workaround we have to do there is on mobile is we have to light up either Microsoft Authenticator app or Cisco Duo or some sort of mobility MFA. But again, there the issue is because we can't use the FIDO2 security key in that Microsoft scenario, we have to then rely on something maybe weaker. So that's kind of the gap and issue that I've experienced, is the cost and then the technical integration there. We can certainly use it much more reliably and consistently on Mac and Windows. We don't have that issue there. So one thing that people can do on their mobile is if they own the device, if it's company owned, then you can actually do a full MDM enrollment of that device. And because MDM enrollment uses a certificate behind the scenes, you can configure your IDP in the case of like Azure, which is my specialty. You can do certificate-based authentication and only allow those devices that you own that have been enrolled in MDM to authenticate. And that to me is a very good mitigating alternative to, say, a FIDO2 security key, which has that problem today. Because now we are able to do device-based authentication using a certificate that's not dependent on an MFA fatigue vulnerability or an issue there. And so that's one thing to kind of be aware of is we have these like nuances and all these sorts of things we have to plan on. The other options for authenticating devices would be outside of MDM would be Microsoft now does support certificate-based authentication like smart card, where some organizations, DoD, military, have these cards that you can actually use the certificate on them to authenticate the user against Azure AD. Previously, we had to use like ADFS to kind of do that integration. Now we actually have that ability in Azure, which is great. And then for Windows computers, we actually have the ability to authenticate it if it's joined to Active Directory. Azure AD Connect can actually issue a certificate on the computer account. And this happens behind the scenes, but in the user interface, there's a checkbox called Hybrid Domain Join. And behind the scenes, when you check that box, Microsoft's going to be issuing a certificate to the computer object. That computer object syncs to Azure AD. And now when you're actually authenticating those Windows devices with Hybrid Domain Join, it's actually performing certificate-based authentication. And the reason why that's important is because when we get back to this MFA fatigue attack, you can create a policy saying only allow my machines that I trust to actually authenticate. If it's a personal machine, a rogue machine, an attacker machine, regardless of what happens with MFA fatigue, they can't connect. So we can do that with Windows today with just a checkbox. Very, very strong third factor. I've tested it at defeating Evil, Jinx, and other attacker in the middle scenarios. It also defeats those as well. So that's something that organizations that even own just Azure AD Premium P1, you can do that today without that additional cost of, say, E5 or those higher license plans. So that's great for Windows. On the mobile side, I think the MDM is the way to go with the third factor. I agree with you. I think the FIDO2 security keys for those high value targets, if you have the budget and you can afford to get those keys rolled out, that offers the URL binding. So when someone goes to authenticate, if that website is not a cryptographic match from where that key originally registered, it will not release that authentication. It's going to protect against phishing. So FIDO2 keys are a phishing resistant MFA provider, whereas often these mobile applications are not phishing resistant. They are vulnerable to attacker in the middle tools like Evil Jinx and other tools. But yeah, so this whole MFA fatigue and this whole concept and how we actually consult and guide people to protect against it. This is one of the biggest topics right now, because this is a common theme in most of these large breaches. If you look at all the big ones that have occurred this year, oftentimes MFA fatigue was a component.
Well, it's a component, and just in the way that identity is always a component in any breach, right? Like, so in the same way that MFA became a kind of bread and butter control that everyone is prescribed, so too now will these additional layers of MFA that need to be considered as a part of your PKI, as a part of your authentication structure and architecture. And those considerations, whereas they before that was a conversation that would largely only be had kind of behind the scenes by architects and people that were standing up those systems. I think that there's a much bigger call now to make that a part of the security strategy for the organization, because identity plays such a critical factor in any incident, no matter what size or type.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that this is an interesting topic is attribution, right? So in this particular disclosure, Cisco tell us they attribute it to Lapsus, and uh, Lapsus, has definitely been in the news a lot lately. Very interestingly, I don't know if you caught this, but I happened to read a headline and read an article that stated that the original teenager in I believe London, who was attributed to some of the Lapsus attacks, this individual was out on bail, and while they were out on bail, they were actually attributed to some of the, like the Rockstar breach and and then they actually went and picked him up again. So I thought it was kind of interesting that you've got someone who, the authorities have detained him. They go, okay, let's send you home. Wait, because you're a minor until the court date. And this individual's out hacking two huge organizations after while they're out on bail.
Yeah, it really also speaks to the interestingness of the criminal mindset.
Right.
You'd think once you got your hand slapped after this that you would put it down at least for a little while and lay low, but no,
Right.
I guess they just can't resist.
Right. Yeah, and also the age, right? So 17 years old.
Yeah.
At, at that age, being able to bypass, security controls at organizations that have probably over the years, spent multiple millions of dollars securing organizations. And this particular, I read the Krebs article on the individual, and I think when they were 14, Stephen, they were into Minecraft. They were just basically modding Minecraft, and that's how they learned their programming skills. 3 years later, they've penetrated probably 12 of some of the top companies in the world. And it's just it's an interesting story. I don't know if a movie will ever be made on it. Another interesting parallel there with hacking is Kevin Mitnick, famous hacker, turned his life around after going to federal prison. And how much is he worth now? Did you see the headline on KnowBe4 being sold?
No, I didn't see it. What was it?
It's something like $4.6 billion.
I guess he the moral of the story there is get your house clean and stop doing bad stuff. Use that knowledge to make some money.
100%, helping. So Kevin turned around, he's helping hundreds and hundreds, I mean, literally thousands of organizations with phishing training, and just sold his company for four. So Kevin, if you're listening, congratulations on the sale of KnowBe4. But wow, yes, into those at Lapsus, there's definitely a better way to make money.
There
So,
is for sure.
all right, well, this has been really fun. I maybe on the next one we could actually talk about some more details, or even other big breaches that have occurred, and lessons we could learn from them. But Stephen, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, take care.
Take care, everybody.